All right, let's talk contracts. We spend so much time figuring out how to make them, right? But what happens after you sign on the dotted line? That's what we're diving into today. The entire journey of a promise, from start to finish, and all the twists and turns in between. Let's jump in.
So you've done it. You signed the contract, it's official, it's binding. But that's really just page one, isn't it? What's the next chapter? What does it really mean to follow through on that promise? And, what happens if things don't go according to plan? How does this whole story end? Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll get to the heart of it, the promise itself. Then we'll talk about what it means to keep your word, or at least offer to. We'll cover the who, when, and where of it all. We'll see how promises can get tangled up with each other. And finally, we'll look at all the ways a contract can wrap up. All right, first things first, let's talk about the absolute core of any contract. It all boils down to one simple idea: doing what you promised. In legal terms, we call this performance. And performance is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, right? It's you holding up your end of the deal. It's the happy ending, the most natural way for a contract to finish its story. You promise to paint the fence, you paint the fence. They promise to pay you, they pay you. Boom, done. The contract's job is over. The legal term for this is that the contract is discharged. Think of it as being honorably dismissed. Its duties are complete. But of course, it's not always that simple, is it? Things can get a little messy. See, in the eyes of the law, fulfilling a promise isn't just about the final act. Sometimes just showing up and making a genuine offer to do your part is just as important. So you have two main types here. Actual performance, that's the ideal scenario, the happy path we just talked about. Everybody does what they said they do. But then there's attempted performance, which is also called a tender. Now imagine this. You show up with the delivery on the right day at the right time, and the client says, "Nope, don't want it." What happens then? Well, you tried. You made a valid offer to perform. This is a huge deal because it means you're not the one in the wrong here. You did your part. Now, for that offer to actually count legally, for your tender to be valid, it has to check a few boxes. It can't just be a half-hearted attempt. First, it's got to be unconditional. You can't show up and say, "And you have to pay me an extra $100." No new strings attached. Second, timing and location are key. You can't show up at 3 a.m. unless that was the deal. Third, you have to offer the whole thing. If the contract was for 100 bags of rice, you can't show up with 80 and call it a day. And finally, the offer has to come from the right person. You or someone you officially authorized. Pretty straightforward, right? Okay, so this whole idea of making a proper offer naturally leads us to the next big questions. Who exactly is supposed to do what? And when and where does it all need to happen? Let's break down the rules of the game. It's pretty intuitive, actually. The person who gets to demand performance is the promisee, the one the promise was made to. And the person who has to do the thing is the promisor, the one who made the promise. Now, sometimes you can have an agent step in, but not always. If the contract is for a unique personal skill, say you hired a specific famous artist to paint a portrait, they can't just send their apprentice. The whole point was their skill. The when and where are also mostly just common sense put into law. If there's a specific date, you've got to hit it, and usually during business hours. If no time is mentioned, the law just says it has to be a reasonable time. What's reasonable? Well, that depends on the situation. Same goes for place. But here's an interesting little detail. If the contract doesn't say where to perform, it's actually on the promiser, the person doing the work, to ask the promisee, "Hey, where do you want this done?" So a lot of contracts aren't just a single promise. They're more like a conversation or a dance, a two-way street. You promise something, and in return, I promise something. These are called reciprocal promises, and they're incredibly common. Basically, it's the classic, "I'll do this if you do that." Your promise is the reason for my promise, and my promise is the reason for yours. Think about buying a coffee. You promise to pay because the barista promises to make your drink. The two promises are totally linked. That's the heart of it. And how these promises are linked can actually vary. There are three main types. First, you have mutual and independent promises. These are rare, but it means we both have to do our thing, no matter what the other person does. Much more common is conditional and dependent. This is like a domino effect. One person has to go first. The example here is perfect. A builder has to pour the foundation before the client pays that first check. The payment is dependent on the foundation being done. And finally, there's mutual and concurrent, where everything has to happen at the exact same time. Think of any cash sale. You hand over the money at the same moment they hand over the product. It's a simultaneous exchange. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on the happy path, right? How a contract gets done. But let's be real, that's only one way this story can end. There are actually a bunch of other ways a contract can be discharged or brought to a close. Let's look at the full picture. Think of this as a map of all the possible endings for a contract. Path number one, the one we know and love, is performance. But look at all these other routes. A contract can also end by mutual agreement, by just running out of time, by some other rule of law, because it becomes impossible to do, or the one everyone dreads, by a breach. Let's take a quick walk down each of these paths. Path number two is the friendly way out. You both just agree to end it. It makes sense, right? If you can agree to start a contract, you can agree to end it. And there are a few flavors of this. You could swap the old contract for a brand new one. That's called novation. You could just decide to cancel the whole thing, which is rescission. Or maybe you just tweak a few terms, or one person agrees to accept a little less than they were promised. It's all about mutual consent. All right, paths 3 and 4 are interesting because they can happen automatically, without anyone even trying. Lapse of time is basically a statute of limitations. If you wait too long to sue over a contract, you lose your right to do so. The contract just expires, then there's operation of law. This is when some big life event intervenes, like a person in a personal skill contract passing away, or a company going bankrupt. The law just steps in and says, okay, this is over. Okay, what about impossibility? This is a big one. What if you just literally can't do what you promised? Well, if it was impossible from the get-go, I mean like a contract to find treasure using magic, the law says that contract was never valid in the first place. But what if it becomes impossible later on? That's called supervening impossibility. The classic example is this. You book a concert hall for your band, but the night before the show, it burns to the ground. You can't perform there. It's not your fault. The contract becomes void, and you're off the hook. And that brings us to the final and least pleasant path, breach of contract. This is the one nobody wants. It's simply when one party breaks their promise. This can happen in two ways. An actual breach is when the due date arrives and they just fail to perform. They don't show up. But there's also an anticipatory breach. This is when they call you up before the due date and say, hey, just so you know, I'm not going to do what I promised. In both cases, the promise is broken and the contract's life cycle ends right there. So there you have it. A contract's journey can end with a handshake, a mutual agreement, or even a crash and burn. But here's the thing to leave you with. When a contract is discharged, is that really the end of the story? Especially when it ends because someone broke a promise or something became impossible? Well, that just opens up a whole new can of worms. Questions about damages and fairness and what happens next. But that's a whole other explainer.